Africa in particular. Writing a book is a long process, and this book was published in 2008, and I think I can honestly say that I started thinking about this book already in 1976. In 1976 I went to Africa for the first time as a backpacker, traveling with a very small budget. I had to stay in cheap hotels. I had to mingle with people of my own kind. I got to know some people in Nairobi, in Kenya, in the hotel where I was staying. They were refugees from Ethiopia. This was in 1976, when Ethiopia had a kind of a revolution. The emperor, Haile Selassie, had been toppled 2 years previously, in 1974. And when I came to Nairobi in 1976, I found that the city was full of refugees. They were mainly young students, like myself, but from Ethiopia. And they were escaping the Red Terror that was unfolding in Ethiopia at that time. I don't know if you're familiar with the situation in Ethiopia in the 1970s, but you know that the Emperor Haile Selassie, he had been in power for a long, long time. In 1974, he was kicked out by a group of soldiers. They called themselves the Derg, which means something like committee in Amharic language. At the beginning, the political profile was a bit uncertain. The surrounding world didn't really know how to look upon those officers who had taken over in Ethiopia. I think a large part of the world agreed that time was up for the emperor. He had to give way to some modern kind of government, and people were really hoping that those officers would provide Ethiopia with a stable government. Now, it didn't take long to find out that the plans were quite different. Those officers who call themselves the Derg, they presented themselves after a while as hardline communists. They were called Afro-Stalinists, actually, because they set up a government in Ethiopia that was very, very hardcore communist-style society. And they started to chase all those who held a different view on politics. And they started a terrible hunt for what they called their political opponents, and that hunt for political opponents was labeled the Red Terror. It started in 1976 and it went on for, let's say, 3 or 4 years before it subsided, and roughly some 50,000 people, mainly young people, were killed in that campaign called the Red Terror. Now, when I came to Nairobi in 1976, I got to know the students, and they were telling me about what was happening in their home country. And I was listening to what they were saying. And I had been studying at university in Sweden before I left. I had been studying development policies. So I was quite familiar with the Swedish development policy, and I knew that Ethiopia was a darling country for Sweden. Sweden has a long relationship with Ethiopia, and I knew that Sweden was supporting this regime that was in power in those days. We had been supporting Haile Selassie, and now we switched over and started to support this government that had toppled Haile Selassie, which I found a little strange. So when those Ethiopian students were telling me about the atrocities that were taking place in their home country, I realized that Sweden was one of the countries, one of the main countries that was supporting this government that was killing young students in Ethiopia. And I didn't like the idea. You know, I felt that something was seriously wrong. Something was seriously wrong with the Swedish development aid if the end result is the killing of young students. So I think the most important impression of Africa during this first trip of mine was that Africa doesn't look as it looks in Swedish publications. When you go to Africa, you get a completely different impression than what you get from reading Swedish magazines, newspapers, watching films in Sweden. I'm sure the same is true in Norway. You really have to go there to see for yourself what that continent looks like. And this enormous difference in ideas and politics that I came to see in Eastern Africa made a strong impression on me. And from there on, I think I started to collect material about the disparity between the goodwill and the end result when we're talking about development aid. Because I think that is really the heart of the matter. You know, people who administer foreign aid, they want to do good. They are do-gooders, as some people call them. Their intentions are good. In most cases, their intentions are good. But when you are dealing with foreign aid, you are handling enormous sums of money. Development aid has, over the centuries, turned into some kind of a billion-dollar industry. Today, so many people are dependent on foreign aid for their survival. And I'm not talking about those who are the so-called recipients of aid. I'm talking about those people who are working in the aid business. And in Sweden, and I'm sure the same is true in Norway, development aid has become so important that nobody really wants to change the fundamental aspects of foreign aid. People want to keep it the way it is. People don't want to rock the boat and change anything because it's so profitable for so many people. And the main point in my book is that foreign aid, to a very large extent, misses its goal altogether. We give with the intention of helping people, but when we do so, we actually very often encourage the basic problems of Africa. And one of the most serious basic problem of Africa is the lack of political stability and the fact that wars are destroying the economies of Africa. Over the last 3 decades, we can say, in Africa, we've had so many wars in so many places, and all those wars have been financed more or less by development aid. And this sounds like a provocative statement, but if you check the facts and figures that you will find at NORAD, that you will find at Swedish SIDA, the equivalent of NORAD, it's very clear. It's very clearly stated. You can read the facts and figures telling you how much money has been given to countries in Africa that are involved in a war, in a civil war or another kind of war. And it's very clear that the money that comes as development aid is to a very large extent used as a resource in that war. In my book, I'm dealing with the countries that I know from my personal experience, and that is Ethiopia, Uganda, South Sudan mainly. And as I told you, in Ethiopia, Sweden has a long tradition of helping Ethiopia. We started by helping the Emperor Haile Selassie by setting up his air force already in the 1950s. And from then on, Ethiopia has been in focus for